My father kicked me out of my sister's wedding, saying in front of everyone that I am not his blood daughter. The humiliation was immense, but I decided not to stay silent and prepared a response worthy of him. In the end, he deeply regretted it when he saw what I did afterward. Dr. Sarah Mitchell adjusted her stethoscope as she finished her rounds at Boston Children's Hospital, her reputation as one of the country's leading pediatric hematologists preceding her wherever she went. At 34, she had dedicated her life to saving children with rare blood disorders, finding solace in the laboratory and operating room that her fractured family had never provided. The irony wasn't lost on her that she spent her days working with blood. The very thing her adoptive father claimed made her less than family. Richard Blackwood had married Sarah's mother when Sarah was just 3 years old, after her biological father died in a car accident. For a brief, shining moment, Sarah had believed she'd found a real father figure. Richard was successful, owning a chain of luxury car dealerships across New England, and he'd seemed to embrace both Sarah and her mother with genuine affection. But everything changed when her mother died of cancer when Sarah was 12. Within a year, Richard had remarried Margaret, a woman 15 years his junior who came with her own daughter, Isabella, Richard's biological child from a previous relationship that Sarah only learned about years later. The transformation was gradual but undeniable. While Isabella received private tutors, riding lessons, and trips to Europe, Sarah worked part-time jobs to pay for her school supplies. When Isabella struggled with grades, Richard hired expensive tutors. When Sarah excelled and earned a scholarship to Harvard Medical School, he barely acknowledged her achievement. "Blood will tell," he'd say, whenever Isabella accomplished anything, no matter how minor, while Sarah's accomplishments were dismissed as mere luck or the result of trying too hard to prove herself. The final blow came 3 months ago, wrapped in ivory cardstock with elegant gold lettering. Isabella's wedding invitation arrived with a cold, clinical note attached. "Sarah, while you're welcome at the church ceremony as a family friend, the reception is limited to blood relatives only. I'm sure you'll understand this is what Isabella wants for her special day. Richard." The dismissal was so casual, so matter-of-fact, that Sarah had stared at the note for a full 10 minutes before the rage set in. 27 years of being treated as a second-class family member had culminated in this, being relegated to the role of a distant acquaintance at her own sister's wedding. She'd attended the ceremony, sitting in the back like a stranger, watching Isabella walk down the aisle in a dress that cost more than most people's cars. During the vows, when the officiant spoke about the joining of two families, Sarah felt the familiar ache of not belonging anywhere. She left immediately after, driving back to Boston with tears streaming down her face, finally accepting what she'd always known but refused to acknowledge. She would never be enough for Richard Blackwood, because she would never share his DNA. That night, Sarah made a decision that would define the rest of her life. If blood was all that mattered to Richard, then she would dedicate her career to understanding blood better than anyone else in the world. She threw herself into her work with renewed passion, researching rare genetic blood disorders with an intensity that impressed even her colleagues. She published groundbreaking papers, developed innovative treatment protocols, and became the go-to specialist for cases that other doctors deemed hopeless. Her personal life remained deliberately sparse. She dated occasionally, but the fear of being abandoned again kept her from forming deep attachments. Her colleagues respected her, her patients adored her, but Sarah had learned to find her family in the children she saved and the medical team that relied on her expertise. It wasn't the family she dreamed of as a little girl, but it was built on something more substantial than genetics. It was built on mutual respect, shared purpose, and genuine care. 3 years had passed since Isabella's wedding, and Sarah had successfully convinced herself that she was better off without the Blackwood family drama. She lived in a beautiful brownstone in Beacon Hill, drove a modest but reliable car, and had built a life that was entirely her own. She no longer waited for Richard's approval or Isabella's acknowledgement. She'd found peace in her independence and pride in her achievements. But peace, Sarah was about to learn, was a fragile thing. As she prepared to leave the hospital that Tuesday evening in October, her pager buzzed with an urgent message from Dr. Martinez, the head of pediatric oncology. The message was brief but chilling. Need immediate consult. Rare blood disorder. Patient, Isabella Blackwood Stevens, age 28. Patient's family specifically requested you. Sarah's hands trembled as she read the message again. Isabella, the golden child, the real daughter, the one whose blood supposedly made her superior, needed the help of the family outcast. The irony was so stark it almost made Sarah laugh, but the medical professional in her immediately suppressed any personal feelings. A patient was a patient, regardless of their connection to her painful past. As she made her way to the oncology wing, Sarah's mind raced with possibilities. Rare blood disorders were her specialty, and there were only a handful that would require her specific expertise. Most were genetic, inherited conditions that lay dormant until triggered by stress, illness, or other factors. The fact that Isabella had developed something so rare suggested it might be something truly unusual. Perhaps one of the conditions Sarah had spent years studying and developing treatments for. The elevator doors opened on the 5th floor, and Sarah stepped into a scene that felt surreal. There, pacing the hallway outside room 518, was Richard Blackwood. He looked older than his 62 years, his usually perfect silver hair disheveled, his expensive suit wrinkled. When he saw Sarah approaching, his face went through a series of emotions: surprise, relief, and something that might have been shame. "Sarah," he said, his voice hoarse, "thank God you came. The doctors say you're the only one who might be able to help her." For a moment, Sarah was transported back to being 12 years old, desperately craving this man's approval and attention. But she was no longer that little girl. She was Dr. Sarah Mitchell, and she had a job to do. "What's her condition?" Sarah asked, her voice professionally neutral. Richard's composure cracked slightly. "They're calling it something I can't pronounce. Paroxysmal something. They said it's extremely rare, that most doctors have never even seen a case. She's been getting worse for weeks, and the regular treatments aren't working." Sarah nodded, already forming a preliminary diagnosis in her mind. Paroxysmal nocturnal hemoglobinuria, with a typical presentation, perhaps, or one of the rarer genetic platelet disorders she'd been researching. Either way, if the family had specifically requested her, it meant Isabella's case was likely beyond the scope of general hematology. "I'll need to examine her and review all her test results," Sarah said. "Has she given consent for me to be involved in her care?" She asked for you specifically," Richard admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "She said if anyone could figure this out, it would be her sister." The word sister hung in the air between them, weighted with years of contradiction and pain. Sarah felt a flutter of something. Not quite hope, but perhaps the memory of hope, before she steeled herself again. Professional obligations came first. "I'll get started on her case immediately," Sarah said. "But I need you to understand that this consultation is happening because I'm a doctor, and she's a patient who needs help. Nothing more." As Sarah walked toward Isabella's room, she couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to change. The family that had defined her worth by her blood was now dependent on her knowledge of blood to save their precious daughter. After years of being told she didn't belong, she was suddenly indispensable. But Sarah had learned long ago that being needed and being valued were two entirely different things. As her hand touched the door handle to room 518, she wondered if Richard Blackwood was about to learn that lesson too. Sarah pushed open the door to room 518. And the sight that greeted her was jarring. Isabella, once the picture of health and vitality, lay pale and fragile against the white hospital sheets. Her usually lustrous blonde hair was thin and brittle. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her skin had an almost translucent quality that Sarah recognized immediately as a sign of severe anemia. Margaret sat beside the bed, clutching Isabella's hand, her own face etched with worry and exhaustion. "Hello, Isabella," Sarah said softly, approaching the bed with the calm confidence she'd developed over years of treating critically ill children. "I'm here to help figure out what's going on." Isabella's eyes fluttered open, and for a moment, Sarah saw a flicker of the spoiled, dismissive girl she remembered. But it was quickly replaced by something Sarah had never seen before in her half-sister's face: genuine fear and vulnerability. "Sarah," Isabella whispered, her voice barely audible, I'm scared. The doctors keep running tests, but nothing seems to work. They said you specialize in cases like mine. Sarah pulled up a chair and began her examination, her trained hands checking lymph nodes, examining Isabella's skin for petechiae and assessing her overall condition. As she worked, she reviewed the chart on her tablet, her expression growing more grave with each test result she absorbed. Isabella, I need to ask you some questions about your symptoms. When did you first notice the fatigue? About 6 weeks ago, Isabella replied weakly. At first, I thought it was just wedding planning stress. But then I started getting these terrible headaches, and I'd bruise from the smallest things. Last week, I couldn't even get out of bed. Sarah nodded, making notes. Have you traveled anywhere recently? Been exposed to any unusual chemicals or medications? Nothing unusual. We went to the Hamptons for our anniversary in August, but that's it. As Sarah continued her examination, she became increasingly certain of her preliminary diagnosis. Isabella's symptoms, combined with the blood work results, pointed to paroxysmal nocturnal hemoglobinuria, PNH, but with an unusually aggressive presentation that suggested a rare genetic variant Sarah had been researching for the past 3 years. I need to order some additional tests, Sarah said, standing up. Specialized genetic sequencing that most hospitals don't routinely perform. The results will take about 48 hours, but they'll give us definitive answers. Margaret spoke up for the first time since Sarah had entered the room. Is she going to be okay? The other doctors seemed so uncertain. Sarah turned to face Margaret, noting how the woman who had always treated her with cold politeness now looked at her with desperate hope. I can't make promises until I have all the results, but I can tell you that I've been researching conditions like this extensively. If my suspicions are correct, there are treatment options, but they're complex and require very specific expertise. What Sarah didn't say, what she was only beginning to fully understand, was that she wasn't just one of the few doctors who could treat this condition. She was quite possibly the only doctor in the country who had developed the specific protocols needed for this particular genetic variant. Her years of feeling like an outsider had driven her to specialize in the most obscure corners of hematology, and now that obsessive focus had made her indispensable. Over the next 2 days, Sarah threw herself into Isabella's case with characteristic intensity. She consulted with colleagues in London and Geneva, reviewed every piece of literature on PNH variants, and ran genetic analyses that cost more than most people's annual salaries. She barely slept, sustained by coffee and the familiar adrenaline of solving a complex medical puzzle. The results, when they came in, confirmed her worst fears and her growing realization of her unique position. Isabella had not just PNH, but a specific genetic variant that Sarah had identified and named in her research, Blackwood-Mitchell syndrome, a naming that now felt like cosmic irony. It was a condition she had discovered in only 12 patients worldwide, and she had successfully treated 7 of them using an experimental protocol she had developed. More importantly, the condition was genetic, inherited, and required immediate intervention to prevent fatal complications. Without treatment, Isabella had perhaps weeks to live. With treatment, Sarah's specific treatment protocol, she had an excellent chance of full recovery. As Sarah reviewed the test results in her office, the full weight of the situation began to dawn on her. The family that had excluded her, diminished her, and made her feel worthless for not sharing their blood now faced a terrible choice: humble themselves before the daughter they had rejected or watch their real daughter die. The knock on her office door interrupted her thoughts. She looked up to see Richard standing in the doorway, looking haggard and defeated in a way she had never seen before. "Sarah, may I come in? We need to talk." She gestured to the chair across from her desk. Richard sat down heavily, and for several moments, they stared at each other across the mahogany surface, the man who had shaped her childhood through his absence of love, and the woman who had become everything he claimed she could never be. "The results are in," Sarah said simply, "and Isabella has a very rare genetic condition called paroxysmal nocturnal hemoglobinuria with a specific variant that I've been researching. Without immediate treatment, her prognosis is poor. With treatment, she has an excellent chance of recovery." Richard leaned forward, hope flickering in his eyes. "What kind of treatment? Whatever it costs, whatever needs to be done. That's where it gets complicated, Sarah interrupted. The treatment protocol required for this specific variant exists in only one place, my research. I've developed the only successful treatment approach for this condition. Isabella would need to be enrolled in my clinical trial, which requires my direct supervision and care for the next 6 months. The color drained from Richard's face as the implications became clear. You mean you're the only one who can save her? I'm the only doctor in the world who has successfully treated this specific condition. Yes. Sarah watched as Richard processed this information, seeing the exact moment when he realized that his years of treating her as less than family had put him in an impossible position. The daughter he had dismissed and excluded now held his real daughter's life in her hands. What do you need from me? He asked quietly. Sarah had been preparing for this moment for 2 days, and she had decided that if Richard Blackwood valued blood so much, he needed to understand what family really meant. She pulled out a folder she had prepared and slid it across the desk. These are my conditions for taking Isabella's case, she said, her voice steady and professional. First, I want a public acknowledgement, in the form of a letter to be published in the Boston Herald's Sunday edition, that you consider me your daughter in every way that matters, and a formal apology for years of excluding me from family events because I wasn't your biological child. Richard's hands shook as he opened the folder and read the draft letter Sarah had prepared. His face went through a range of emotions, shock, anger, and finally, something that looked like understanding. Second, Sarah continued, I want a donation of $2 million to be made to Boston Children's Hospital to establish the Sarah Mitchell Research Foundation for Rare Blood Disorders. This foundation will ensure that other children with conditions like Isabella's receive the care they need, regardless of their family's ability to pay. And third, Sarah said, her voice growing softer but no less firm, I want you to understand that after Isabella's treatment is complete, I don't want a relationship with this family. I'm doing this because I'm a doctor and because Isabella deserves to live, but I won't be your daughter on command just because it's convenient. Richard stared at the papers for a long moment, then looked up at Sarah with something she had never seen in his eyes before, genuine respect, tinged with regret. You've become quite remarkable, he said quietly. I think I'm finally seeing who you really are. I became remarkable in spite of you, not because of you, Sarah replied. The question is, are you willing to do what's necessary to save Isabella? Richard picked up a pen with trembling hands. Where do I sign? As Sarah watched her adoptive father sign the documents that would finally give her the recognition she had craved as a child, she felt a strange mixture of satisfaction and emptiness. She had won, but the victory tasted different than she had imagined. She wasn't that little girl anymore, desperate for his approval. She was a woman who had built her own worth, and Richard's acknowledgement, while satisfying, could never undo the years of pain his rejection had caused. I'll start Isabella on the treatment protocol tomorrow, Sarah said, taking back the signed documents. She'll need to stay here for the initial phase, which will take about 2 weeks. After that, she can continue outpatient treatment, but she'll need to see me twice a week for the next 5 months. Whatever she needs, Richard said, standing up. He paused at the door and turned back to Sarah. For what it's worth, I am sorry. I was wrong about what makes someone family. You've shown more grace in this situation than I deserved. After he left, Sarah sat alone in her office, looking out at the Boston skyline as the sun set over the city. Tomorrow, she would begin the process of saving Isabella's life. Not because Isabella was her sister, not because Richard had finally acknowledged her, but because it was the right thing to do. She had spent her entire life trying to prove she belonged in the Blackwood family. Now, finally, she realized she had belonged somewhere else all along, in the community of healers who judged people by their actions, not their genetics. The family that had rejected her for her blood would be saved by her knowledge of blood, and in the end, that poetic justice was worth more than any acknowledgement Richard could give her. But as Sarah prepared to leave her office and begin the most important case of her career, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. Saving Isabella's life would prove that love and dedication mattered more than genetics, but whether it would truly heal the wounds of the past remained to be seen. The next morning, Sarah arrived at the hospital before dawn, as had become her habit during complex cases. Isabella's treatment would begin today, and despite everything that had happened between their families, Sarah felt the familiar surge of determination that came with having a patient's life in her hands. She had reviewed the protocol one final time, consulted with her research team, and prepared for every possible complication. Isabella was awake when Sarah entered her room, looking marginally better after 2 days of supportive care, but still critically ill. Margaret and Richard sat on either side of the bed, their faces etched with exhaustion and worry. "Good morning, Isabella," Sarah said, pulling up her tablet. "We're going to start your treatment today. I want to explain exactly what we're going to do and what you can expect." For the next 20 minutes, Sarah walked them through the treatment protocol she had developed, a complex regimen of targeted immunotherapy, specialized blood products, and genetic modification techniques that would essentially reprogram Isabella's immune system. It was cutting-edge medicine that existed nowhere else in the world, the result of Sarah's years of obsessive research into the rarest blood disorders. "The initial phase will be challenging," Sarah explained. "You'll feel worse before you feel better, and there are risks we need to monitor carefully. But in the 7 patients I've treated with this protocol, we've had a 100% success rate." Isabella reached out and grasped Sarah's hand, the first time she had voluntarily touched her half-sister since they were children. "Thank you," she whispered. I know we haven't always been close, but I'm grateful you're here." Sarah squeezed her hand gently. "I'm here as your doctor, Isabella, and as your doctor, I promise I'll do everything in my power to make you well." The treatment began that afternoon. Sarah had arranged for Isabella to be moved to a specialized isolation unit where she could monitor every aspect of her care personally. The first week was brutal. Isabella's body initially fought the treatment, her condition appearing to worsen as her immune system was essentially rebooted. Sarah barely left the hospital, sleeping in the on-call room and monitoring Isabella's progress around the clock. Richard and Margaret maintained a constant vigil as well, and Sarah found herself witnessing a side of Richard she had never seen before. He was tender with Isabella, reading to her when she was too weak to focus on television, holding her hand during the worst moments. But more surprising was how he began to treat Sarah, with deference, respect, and something that looked like genuine admiration for her medical expertise. "I never understood what you did," he said to Sarah one evening as they stood outside Isabella's room, watching her sleep. "I mean, I knew you were a doctor, but seeing you work. The way you explain everything, how you anticipated every complication. It's remarkable." Sarah didn't respond immediately. Part of her wanted to point out the bitter irony that he was praising her now when her skills could save his real daughter. But another part of her recognized something genuine in his tone, a humility she had never heard before. "This is what I've dedicated my life to," Sarah said simply. "Understanding blood disorders, developing treatments for children who would otherwise die. It's not just my job, it's my calling." "I think I'm beginning to understand that," Richard replied quietly. By the end of the second week, Isabella's condition had stabilized, and the markers in her blood work showed that Sarah's treatment was working. The dangerous phase was passing, and Isabella was beginning the slow journey back to health. It was then that Richard fulfilled the first of Sarah's conditions. The letter appeared in the Boston Herald on a Sunday morning, taking up half of the editorial page. It was exactly what Sarah had demanded, a public acknowledgement of her as his daughter and a formal apology for years of exclusion. But reading it, Sarah was surprised by the depth of emotion Richard had poured into the words. "To my daughter, Sarah Mitchell. For too many years, I allowed myself to believe that biology determined the bonds of family. I was wrong in the most fundamental way a parent can be wrong. You are my daughter not because of the blood in your veins, but because of the love in your heart, the brilliance in your mind, and the compassion in your soul. When your mother brought you into my life, you were a gift I was too foolish to properly cherish. Instead of seeing the remarkable person you were becoming, I focused on meaningless distinctions that said more about my own limitations than about your worth. You have grown into an extraordinary woman and physician, saving lives and advancing medical science in ways that make me proud to call you my daughter. Your dedication to helping others, your intellectual achievements, and your grace under pressure are testaments to the person you've chosen to become. Not despite the challenges I put in your path, but perhaps because of the strength those challenges revealed in you. I publicly apologize for excluding you from family gatherings, for treating you as less than my child, and for allowing others to do the same. You deserved better from me, and I can only hope that this acknowledgement, while late, begins to repair the damage my narrow-mindedness has caused. You are my daughter in every way that matters, and I am honored that you bear the name Mitchell, a name you've elevated through your own remarkable achievements. With love, respect, and deepest regret for lost years, Richard Blackwood. Sarah read the letter 3 times, sitting in her kitchen with her morning coffee. The words she had demanded were all there, but they carried more weight than she had expected. This wasn't just a grudging compliance with her conditions, it was a genuine acknowledgement of his failures and her worth. Her phone began ringing almost immediately. Colleagues from the hospital, medical school classmates she hadn't spoken to in years, even reporters wanting to know more about the brilliant doctor Richard Blackwood had praised so publicly. The story had apparently captured public imagination, the adopted daughter who became a world-renowned specialist, saving the life of the sister who had excluded her. But the most meaningful call came from Dr. Patricia Williams, the chief of staff at Boston Children's Hospital. "Sarah, I've been trying to reach you all morning. Richard Blackwood's office called an hour ago. He's donating $2 million to establish the Sarah Mitchell Research Foundation for Rare Blood Disorders. The board is thrilled, but I wanted to make sure this was something you knew about and supported." Sarah smiled for the first time in weeks. "Yes, Dr. Williams. It's part of Isabella's treatment plan, you might say." 3 months into Isabella's treatment, the transformation was remarkable. Not just in Isabella, who was showing signs of complete recovery, but in the entire family dynamic. Isabella had insisted on accompanying Sarah to some of her research meetings, eager to understand the science behind her cure. She had also begun volunteering with families of other patients, using her experience to provide hope and support. Margaret, who had always treated Sarah with cold politeness, had become almost apologetic in her interactions, clearly uncomfortable with the role she had played in Sarah's exclusion. She had started sending Sarah handwritten thank you notes and had even asked if there was anything she could do to support Sarah's research. But the most profound change was in Richard. The man who had spent decades defining family by genetics had become Sarah's most vocal advocate. He attended medical conferences with her, contributed additional funding to her research, and spoke publicly about the importance of supporting adopted children in pursuing their dreams. "You know what the strangest part is?" Isabella said one afternoon as Sarah administered her weekly treatment. "I used to resent you." Sarah looked up from the IV line she was adjusting. "Resent me? For what? For being smarter than me. For working harder. For not needing Dad's approval the way I did." Isabella's voice was soft, contemplative. "I realize now that I was jealous of your independence. You built something real, something that couldn't be taken away from you. I just married well and lived off Dad's money." "There's nothing wrong with the path you chose," Sarah said diplomatically. "Isn't there?" Isabella met her eyes. "When I got sick, what did I have to show for my life?" "But you had knowledge that could save lives. You had built something meaningful. I think that's why I was so scared, not just of dying, but of realizing I had never really lived." Sarah felt an unexpected surge of empathy for her half-sister. For all the privilege Isabella had enjoyed, she had also been trapped by it, defined by her father's wealth and approval in ways that had stunted her growth as an individual. "It's not too late to build something meaningful," Sarah said gently. "You have your whole life ahead of you now." Isabella nodded thoughtfully. "I've been thinking about that. I want to work with the foundation you're establishing, not just as a figurehead, but really work, learn about rare diseases, help families navigate the medical system. I want to earn my place in this family, the way you did." 6 months after Isabella's diagnosis, Sarah stood before a packed auditorium at Harvard Medical School, delivering the keynote address at a symposium on rare blood disorders. In the audience, she could see Richard, Margaret, and Isabella sitting in the front row, No longer the family that had excluded her, but something new and still undefined. Her speech focused on the breakthrough treatment she had developed, but she concluded with words that surprised even herself. Medical science teaches us that family isn't about the genes we inherit, but about the care we provide for one another. Some of the strongest immune systems I've seen belong to patients whose families, biological or chosen, rally around them with love and support. Healing happens not just through medicine, but through the recognition that we all belong to each other in our shared humanity. After the presentation, as she was surrounded by colleagues and researchers eager to discuss her work, Richard approached her. "Sarah, I wonder if I could speak with you privately for a moment." They walked to a quiet corner of the reception hall, away from the crowds. Richard looked nervous, an expression Sarah had rarely seen on his usually confident face. "I know you said that after Isabella's treatment was complete, you didn't want a relationship with our family," he began. "And I understand why. We haven't earned the right to call you our daughter." Sarah waited, unsure where this conversation was heading. "But I was wondering if you might consider giving us a chance to earn that right now. Not because of what we were, but because of who we might become. Isabella has been transformed by this experience. She's enrolled in a nursing program and wants to specialize in rare disease care. Margaret has started volunteering with families of chronically ill children. And He paused, struggling with words. "I've learned that being a father isn't about DNA. It's about showing up, supporting dreams, and loving unconditionally. I failed at that for decades, but I'd like to try to do better, if you'll let me." Sarah looked across the room at Isabella, who was deep in conversation with one of Sarah's research partners, her face animated as she discussed treatment protocols. She thought about the journey that had brought them all to this moment, her childhood pain, her drive to excel, the medical mystery that had forced them all to confront their definitions of family. "Richard," she said finally, "I'm not sure I know how to be your daughter after all these years." "Maybe we could figure it out together," he suggested. "Maybe we could learn what family really means, not the family we were born into, but the family we choose to become." Sarah considered his words. The little girl inside her, who had always craved this man's approval, felt a flutter of hope. But the woman she had become, independent, accomplished, whole, knew that any relationship they built now would have to be different from the traditional father-daughter dynamic she had once desperately wanted. "I'll think about it," she said finally. "But it would have to be on equal terms. I'm not looking for a father figure anymore, Richard. I'm a grown woman who's built her own life. If we're going to have a relationship, it needs to be based on mutual respect between adults." "I wouldn't want it any other way," he replied. "You've taught me that respect isn't something you're owed because of your position in someone's life. It's something you earn through your actions." 3 months later, Sarah found herself sitting around a dinner table in Richard's Beacon Hill mansion, a table she had never been invited to as a child. But this wasn't a family dinner in the traditional sense. Isabella was there with her husband, excitedly discussing her progress in nursing school. Margaret had brought materials from the charitable foundation she now ran for families affected by rare diseases. Richard showed photos from his recent trip to a conference on adoption support services, a cause he had embraced with the same energy he once put into his business ventures. And Sarah was there not as the excluded adopted daughter, but as an accomplished professional whose expertise and opinion were valued and sought. They discussed her latest research, her plans for expanding the foundation, and her upcoming sabbatical to lecture in Europe. "You know," Isabella said as dessert was served, "I used to think family was about sharing the same blood. But sitting here tonight, I realize it's about sharing the same commitment to each other's growth and happiness." Sarah smiled, thinking about how much they had all changed. The crisis that could have destroyed them had instead revealed what they were capable of becoming. Not a perfect family, but a real one, built on choice rather than circumstance. "I have something to say," Richard announced, standing up with his wine glass. "I want to propose a toast to Sarah, not because she saved Isabella's life, though we're eternally grateful for that, but because she saved all of our lives. She showed us what it means to build something meaningful, to judge people by their character rather than their genetics, and to love with both boundaries and grace. As glasses were raised around the table, Sarah felt a profound sense of completion, not because she had finally won Richard's approval, but because she had learned that she never needed it. The family she had always wanted wasn't the one that would accept her despite not sharing their blood, but the one that would value her for exactly who she had chosen to become. "To second chances," Sarah said, raising her own glass, "and to the family we choose to build together." But even as she spoke the words, Sarah knew that her greatest victory wasn't in healing this family. It was in discovering that she had always been whole, with or without their acceptance. The little girl who had once desperately wanted to belong had grown into a woman who belonged everywhere she chose to invest her love and expertise. The blood that ran through her veins might not connect her to the Blackwood family tree, but the knowledge in her mind and the compassion in her heart had proven more powerful than any genetic bond. In the end, she had learned the most important lesson of all. Family isn't about the blood you're born with. It's about the love you choose to give and the lives you choose to touch. And as she looked around the table at the people who had once excluded her and now sought to include her, Sarah realized that sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone isn't forgiveness, but the opportunity to become worthy of forgiveness. Richard, Margaret, and Isabella had seized that opportunity. And in doing so, they had all discovered what family could be when it was built on choice, respect, and genuine care for one another's well-being.